Guten Tag und herzlich willkommen zu unserem Webinar Supplying the South African Automotive Sector. Mein Name ist Martin Meischl, ich bin der österreichische Wirtschaftsdelegierte in Johannesburg und es freut mich, Sie heute zu dieser Veranstaltung begrüßen zu dürfen. Nachdem die Vortragenden auf Englisch sprechen, werden wir nun auch auf Englisch wechseln. Thank you so much for taking time this afternoon to meet with us. Just in the last couple of minutes, we were running into some technical issues, unfortunately, because South Africa is suffering the so-called load shedding. That means certain parts of the towns are being disconnected from electricity and they have to rely on generators or other sources of energy. And therefore, we have to change a little bit the order of our webinar. We're going to start with a brief introduction from myself, the Austrian Trade Commissioner for Southern Africa. Then we will hear from James Brown regarding entering the South African after-sales market. Afterwards, we will have a presentation by Michael Mabasa. He's the chairperson of NAMSA, the National Association of Automotive Manufacturers in South Africa. And then we will hear from a representative from the Department of Transportation. Mr. Themba Tenza, unfortunately, is unavailable to join us today, and therefore he will be replaced by Opang Kotsane. Like I said, I want to start with a brief overview about the Austrian-South African business relations. And the external trade obviously is very important for us. South Africa is by far the most important trading partner of Austria on the African continent. And 1/3 of Austrian exports to Africa go to South Africa. And 1/4 of African imports to Austria come from South Africa. Obviously, the most important category is engines. And you see in the top right corner of this slide an engine from the BMW engine plant in Steyr. And this is by far the most important Austrian export product to South Africa. Last year, Austria exported 355 million euros in the so-called category machinery and transport equipment. And within this category, 90 million euros were gasoline engines and 128 million euros were diesel engines from the BMW plant in Steyr going to the BMW assembly plant in Rosslyn, close to Pretoria. There are 7 OEMs in South Africa: Ford, Toyota, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Isuzu, Volkswagen, and Nissan. And on this slide, we just wanted to show you now the most recent models which are being produced here locally in South Africa. That's the Ford Ranger, together with the Volkswagen Amarok, the BMW X3, the Toyota Corolla Cross, and the Mercedes C-Class. Those are super modern vehicles which are being produced in South Africa for the local market and obviously also mainly for the export. And like I said, we have to change the order of the presentation a little bit, and it's my pleasure now to introduce to you James Brown. He works as the sales manager at Tech Alliance, and he's going to give a brief overview about entering the South African after-sales market. James, thank you so much for taking time to talk to our Austrian audience, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martin. So just to give you a nutshell, Tech Alliance is actually a German company. They specialize in data management solutions with the automotive industry. They provide distributors, traders, workshops, and dealers vehicle-specific maintenance data. This is specifically used for the e-commerce B2B and B2C solutions, and it also gives further ability to gain further market insights through our customizable data analytics and reporting tools. Just a background on Tech Alliance. So Tech Alliance is actually a German company. It was founded by many famous brands with the aim to reduce printing catalogs. Amongst our shareholders are brands such as Bosch, Tenneco, Continental, Bilstein Group, Victorines, and many other reputable brands. Our main product, which is called TechDoc, can be seen as a digital platform that provides a cataloging solution as well as added value of brand recognition and promotion through customizable reporting tools and extra marketing capability channel distribution as well. COVID-19 obviously did accelerate the e-commerce sector in South Africa and the need for the consumer to go digital. The South African automotive aftermarket is basically consists of traders, workshops, spares retailers, and wholesalers. These guys currently are just brick and mortar shops, and obviously amongst our three biggest customers, we have of the traders are the largest customers that we actually deal with. We found that there was a structured distribution network in South African automotive aftermarkets. To further give you more information on this, we see promising potential with local brands and manufacturers. Brands meaning local, like parts manufacturers, anyone that manufactures their own brand, and traders would be anyone that actually distributes many of those brands. To support this potential, we actually registered an entity in December 2021 to accelerate the growth in the current markets in the SADC region. Our goals are to create vehicle standardization through reference with our catalog solutions. TikTok is currently the standard in Europe and many other parts of the world. Another one of our goals is to actually have more local suppliers on board. So we actually aim to have more brands on board in our TikTok catalog, because this TikTok catalog can facilitate many ordering solutions through spare shops, workshops, retailers, and it will reduce the need for consumers to actually use printed versions. And we aim to actually have one platform, one catalog, so that the whole automotive aftermarket can be using the same reference in terms of vehicle references. We belong to an organization called Right to Repair. So Right to Repair is an international organization that aims to provide fair competition in the automotive aftermarket, as well as the ability for the customer to get their vehicle repaired at a workshop of their choice without actually having to reduce, or not reduce, shall I say, to void their warranty. Many of the quality brands are already affiliated with Right to Repair, such as Bosch, AutoZone is a trader. So we belong to this because we feel like this is a good organization to actually kind of accelerate the automotive aftermarket. And the automotive aftermarket is actually a growing sector in South Africa, especially when it comes to, when you look at the vehicle car park, we estimate the car park to be around about 9 million vehicles in operation on the road. And with the current trends of the South African vehicle sector, in terms of new vehicles versus used vehicles, South Africa is not like Europe, where you'll find many customers or consumers will keep their vehicle for 3 to 4 years. The vehicles in South Africa could actually be in operation for about 10 to 15 years. And that, of course, will encourage the need for basically repairs instead of buying new vehicles. And our main goal, or our main business model, is based around spare parts in the TikTok catalog, spare parts and brands and the vehicles that it fits to. Our current challenges that we face is actually the slow transition of the automotive aftermarket in South Africa, because although that it has accelerated in the e-commerce sector, we have found potential there. Many of the individual spare shops and customers are not ready. They're not ready for this transition, but we aim to actually grow that and change that. A lot of the problem is there's a lot of brands, individual brands that want to be or could potentially be in TikTok, still see data and information in vehicles and parts information as intellectual property. Whereas Europe, everyone just is, if you're not on a TikTok, in the TikTok catalog in Europe, then basically the consumer doesn't recognize you as a reputable brand. And of course, e-commerce is not really a focal point for some of the spare shops, but we do see major potential to change that in the forthcoming future. You can get some more information on our products and services at www.techalliance.co.za. Thank you very much, Martin.
Thank you very much, James, for this interesting introduction to the South African after-sales market. Should there be any questions from our attendees, please feel free to put those questions in the chat, and we will be happy to answer them together with our panelists at the end of this webinar. We will now go backwards in the order, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you Michael Mabasa. Michael Mabasa is a transport economist and currently serves as the Chief Executive Officer at NAMSA, the Automotive Business Council. He also serves as a council member on the International Organization of Motor Vehicle Manufacturers. Michael, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Fantastic. We can hear you loud and clearly. Michael, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. And once again, apologies for the transmission issues we had earlier. And thanks very much for inviting us. I did send my presentation via PDF. I'm not sure whether you can be able to showcase that at some point. But yeah, thanks very much. I think the automotive industry, obviously in South Africa, it's very matured. NAMSA is obviously the Automotive Business Council in South Africa that represents all our OEMs in the country. We've got more than 49 OEMs in the passenger and light commercial vehicle space that are producing vehicles in the country, and also those that are also importing vehicles into South Africa. We also have a huge population of heavy commercial vehicle OEMs, particularly our truck and buses that are currently operating in the market. We're obviously very proud that South Africa has a very huge population of OEMs that are in South Africa, which is fantastic for us. And we're able to obviously continue to develop the market and grow the automotive industry as firmly as we can. We're currently hosting about 7 local manufacturing OEMs in the country, in 3 major provinces, Gauteng, and also in the Eastern Cape, and also in KwaZulu-Natal. And those OEMs that are currently in South Africa that are manufacturing, Toyota is obviously the market leader in the country, both in terms of production and also new vehicle sales, based in KZN in KwaZulu-Natal. We also have in the heartland of Gauteng 3 OEMs, Ford Motor Company, we have Nissan South Africa, and also BMW. And then in the Eastern Cape province, we have VW South Africa, we have Isuzu, and also Mercedes-Benz. So those are the key OEMs that are based in the country that are obviously manufacturing and also investing quite significantly in the economic life of South Africa. I'm sure that you are aware that out of these 7 manufacturers, we obviously are exporting their vehicles in different markets around the world. We're currently exporting into 152 different markets around the world. And we're very pleased, obviously, that we are able to drive some of the conversations that we need to be able to manage. I'm not sure how much time I have. I'm happy to go through the presentation that I've shared. I can see that it's already on the screen. If you can go to the next slide very briefly, I can be able to quickly walk through. So this slide is just a reconfirmation of the key brands that we are representing in the country. As you can see on the left-hand side of that slide, the 7 going down are those that are manufacturing in South Africa. In the middle, in blue, those are the brands that are importing vehicles into South Africa, and they're in the main, passenger and light commercial vehicles. And then on your right-hand side in gray, that's the heavy commercial vehicles that we have in South Africa. On the next slide, we show you we've expanded NAMSA's membership, where we are not only representing vehicle manufacturers, we're also representing other partners who have interest in the automotive industry. As you can see there, all the 4 banks, major banks in South Africa, are members of NAMSA as well, because they see the future in terms of contributing meaningfully to the history and to the future of the automotive industry. If you go to the next slide, also we show you other additional members that we have who are contributing quite very significantly in terms of growing the automotive industry in the country. On the next slide, we obviously speak to very specifically the vision of the sector in relation to what we are currently focusing on. And this slide really emphasizes what we call our strategy on a page and how we create value to the automotive industry in South Africa. and it's focusing mainly on 4 key strategic objectives, around policy, public policy, transformation, data management, and growth. And I think for us as South Africa, it's very, very key. Those 4 are absolutely very, very key because we are obviously having intentions to grow the South African automotive industry. You'd recall that when you look at the global production of vehicles around the world, South Africa is the 21st biggest market in relation to vehicle production. And in terms of our market share, we currently occupy only about 0.62% of the global production market around the world. And our ambition is obviously to continue to increase that capacity as much as possible as we can. So I'm not going to talk to this slide in detail, but just to safely say that our strategy is really to reimagine the future of the automotive industry together with all our partners to be able to drive the growth that we want to see the automotive industry delivers. On the next page, we summarizes some of the key challenges that we have currently as the automotive industry. And I'm sure many of you are aware that currently in South Africa, we have a huge energy crisis in terms of the unstable national grid that we have. As a result, we've got load shedding, which is obviously impacting quite hugely on our capacity to be able to produce vehicles, sell vehicles, and most importantly, export vehicles. Because as a market currently, we export 64% of the vehicles that we produce in the country out of the country to 152 different markets, as I indicated earlier on. And unfortunately, the current energy challenges that we have impacted absolutely onto the automotive industry. The second one is really around policy uncertainty. I think there's a lot of movement that is happening globally in terms of new energy vehicles and the future of those markets in relation to how they want to manage new energy vehicles going forward. And I think South Africa has been absolutely very slow in providing the necessary policy certainty to the market to say, what is our attitude in terms of the adoption of new energy vehicles in our market going forward. And then the last one, it's really around infrastructure backlog, where we have some major challenges, particularly in relation to logistics value chain, to be able to make sure that we've got a much reliable infrastructure that helps us to be able to drive some of the key drivers that we want to see that will help us to grow the automotive industry. I'm not going to talk to what you see on that carpet of that slide. That's obviously a multiplicity of additional challenges that we have in the country that obviously impacts very, very directly on our capacity to be able to produce and obviously grow the automotive industry as we would like to see. On the next slide, we really confirm and reconfirm that load shedding has been a very, very huge challenge for us, as a country. That slide shows you, the 52 months, weekly progression of how our electricity disruptions have been. And you can clearly see that towards the end, of the year, last year, from week 48 of last year into 2023, our energy supplies from Eskom and the availability factor of energy in the country has absolutely been impacted very negatively to a point where currently we are now sitting in what we call a stage 6 of load shedding. And that obviously has a huge impact on the capacity of the sector to be able to deliver a sustainable and predictable supply of and production of vehicles into the market. On the next slide, we briefly showcase some of the numbers, and this is the contribution that the automotive industry is making to the South African economy. We currently, if you look at our gross domestic product, obviously, it has shrunk quite significantly, because 10 years ago, we used to contribute almost 7% towards the South African gross domestic product. Currently, we're sitting at 4.3%. If you look at our total auto exports as a percentage of the total value of exports that goes out of the country. We're currently sitting at 12.5%. We've obviously contributed, if you look at our export earnings that came into the country last year, particularly in 2021, was sitting at more than 2 billion South African rands, and we've also contributed around 8.8 billion in relation to our capital expenditure. The industry, in terms of our skilled, highly skilled people that we employ, currently we're sitting just under 500,000 people in 2022, and we are certainly absolutely excited that as we go forward into this new evolution of new energy vehicles, we'll certainly be in a position to contribute even a lot more into the future. On the next slide, we also reconfirm that if you look at production numbers and also new vehicle sales, you would see that you would notice that in 2022, we've sold more than 500,000 vehicles in the market. We've produced also more than 500,000 vehicles in South Africa, 64% of which, as I indicated earlier on, are exported, which obviously represents that 551,000 units that goes out of the country. And then in relation to the revenue that we were able to bring up as a result of, we can, it's more than just under 200 billion in terms of new vehicle sales, particularly in 2022. On the next slide, we also reconfirm, the contribution, as I indicated earlier on, when you look at market share, both in Africa and also globally. So in Africa, we're currently contributing in terms of production, 53.6% of Africa's production capability and capacity. And obviously it has dropped quite significantly because 10 years ago, South Africa was contributing 76% of Africa's total production. That number has obviously dropped quite significantly because we've seen some emergence of other markets. If you look at what's happening now in Morocco, Egypt, Ghana, and Nigeria, have really taken up the responsibility of producing vehicles in those markets. And that obviously is a very big concern for us as South Africa because the proximity of those countries in the west of the continent is obviously a very huge concern because their proximity to the European market, which is obviously our biggest market as South Africa, is obviously going to be threatening South Africa's ability to be able to move very, very quickly. And the reason why we've identified, as I indicated earlier on, policy uncertainty as one of our biggest challenge is precisely because those markets that I've referred to have moved absolutely at an aircraft speed in developing their own auto policies, and they've now provided also certainty to their markets in relation to new energy vehicles and the production thereof. And then obviously I spoke about the global production. We're currently number 21 relative to other markets, and then which obviously constitute just 0.62% of the global market that we currently serve. And then we're exporting our vehicles to 152 different markets around the world. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, on the next slide, and I'm going to be summarizing very quickly. On the next slide, we show you the South African market in terms of the selection of our market relative to what's happening in other, markets around the world. So South Africa has, the widest selection market ratio in terms of size. I mean, if you look at the brands that we are currently distributing in South Africa, we've got 42 passenger brands that are in South Africa today. Out of those 42 brands, we have 2,513 model derivatives that are on our roads in South Africa today. And that's the biggest and the widest selection. So South Africans have a very, very big selection of vehicles that they can be able to choose from. Similarly, in relation to our light commercial vehicles, which we call bakkies here in the market, and then also heavy commercial vehicles. So we currently have a huge selection of vehicles that are available in the market that people can be able to choose from. On the next slide, obviously, we acknowledge the fact that these numbers will drop significantly as we now progress into the conversations around new energy vehicles, because that's going to be our next frontier, because we want to continue to produce vehicles, not just internal combustion engines that we are currently producing, but we also want to be able to participate very actively in the production of new energy vehicles. We know that Europe, we know that the United States and some parts of Asia have already taken a decision. If you look at, for example, the European Union, it has already taken a decision that by 2035, they will be banning the importation of internal combustion engines in their market. We know that the United Kingdom has also taken a similar decision that by 2030 they will be also banning the inclusion of internal combustion engines in their market. And what that means, because 64% of our customers are currently those markets in particular that are already giving us an indication that in the next 5 years, they will no longer be accepting our vehicles. It obviously means that South Africa has to move at an accelerated pace to be able to make sure that we are able to secure our capacity to be able to produce new energy vehicles. We've also taken a decision as the automotive industry that we're not only going to focus on the production of battery electric vehicles, but we are certainly going to be also promoting other drivetrains into the market, whether it's hybrid vehicles, hydrogen, and also LPG vehicles, so that we can really be able to make sure that we're able to provide a wide array of different options that people can be able to choose from. So we are certainly going to be under a lot of pressure, particularly in the next 2 to 3 years, to be able to recalibrate our current manufacturing lines that we have in South Africa, but also most importantly, also to attract new business, in terms of manufacturers that can be able to come through to South Africa to be able to help us to accelerate, these priorities that we are currently looking at in terms of the production of vehicles. We also accept as South African market that the rate of adoption for new energy vehicles in Africa and South Africa in particular is not going to be at the same pace as we see in Europe, as we see in the United States and other markets. I think Africa is going to, adopt new energy vehicles at a much slower pace. And we also accept that internal combustion engines are going to be with us for a much prolonged period, 15 to 20 years, after we have introduced some of these vehicles onto our markets. Currently in South Africa, we've got 22 battery electric vehicles that are in the market, and that number is growing year on year. And we believe very strongly that as the number grows, we will certainly be in a position to encourage a lot of South Africans to obviously switch into the new technology. Then I think my last slide, which is the next slide, is just to give you some numbers in relation to the adoption of electric vehicles in the last 5 years. If you look at 2018 up until 2022, you can clearly see that the growth of adoption, although on a very low base, has absolutely been incredible. We've seen an increase, year-on-year increase of 431% of new energy vehicles, in South Africa. As I indicated, obviously of a very low base. In 2022, we sold just more than 4,700 vehicles in the new energy vehicle space. We're also seeing a very huge increase, specifically driven by hybrid options, because a lot of South Africans are still very anxious about going for a battery electric vehicles completely. They would still want to have a vehicle that has petrol or diesel, and then of course the best of both worlds. So we've seen a huge increase in relation to our hybrid offering in the market, and we obviously are projecting that growth is definitely going to be increasing, particularly also because of the distances that we are currently traveling, from one point to another. I mean, if you look at a person who's driving, from Musina on the north of the country all the way to Cape Town. That trip, one trip, is obviously more than 3,000 kilometers, and we still have obviously a lot of range anxiety, and that's why we believe very strongly that hybrid options will obviously continue to drive the market quite very significantly. I'm going to stop there, and obviously happy to engage further with the panel, and obviously happy to take any other questions from the session. I hope the information we've shared was very useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. And you already started with talking about the transition from internal combustion engines to electrical vehicles. And it is my honor now to introduce to you Bopang Kutsane. She's the project manager for the Green Transport Strategy for South Africa. She works at the Department of Transport. And Bopang, I hope your technical environment works fine now, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for extending the invite for us to attend this webinar. I'll just introduce myself briefly. I am Bopang Kutsane, and I am the project manager for the Green Transport Strategy in South Africa. And I'll just take you through my slide to specifically address what the policy positioning for the department is regarding new energy efficient vehicles. The next slide, please. This is just the brief contents page of what I'll be taking you through. You can go to the next slide, please. So on a policy basis, the department in 2018 saw that there was a need for an environmental policy to specifically deal with the environmental impacts that the transport system or the transport sector in total has on the environment. And we developed the Green Transport Strategy for South Africa, which in essence came up with a plan on how we're going to address decarbonizing the sector, as well as trying to come up with ways and policy regimes to start having a conceptual, philosophical approach on how to actually start having a significant reduction in the emissions for the transportation sector. Next slide, please. So the policy directive for the Green Transport Strategy is based on a number of different policies that are found in the government space. Of course, the main one is the White Paper on National Climate Change Response Policy, and that is also followed closely by the Electric Vehicles Industry Roadmap from the DTIC, as well as the Automotive Production Development Program, APDP, from the Department of Trade and Industry, as well as the CAMP from Department of Trade and Industry as well, because in totality, the transport sector is quite cross-cutting in South Africa. So therefore, we are influenced by other policy directives and policy discussions in other government departments. So we constantly have to ensure that our policy direction is aligned across all government departments. And of course, we're also influenced by international policy statements and policy conventions that we are party to, like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, as well as the nationally determined contributions. Next slide, please. So according to the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, we see that the transport sector accounts for 10.8% of national GHG emissions. And from that 10.8%, 91.2 comes from the direct emissions of the combustion of petrol and diesel, which is the highest so far as a subsector. So we saw that the direct interventions that we would need to take with immediate urgency were for the road sector, which therefore carved out a way in which we started dealing with the implementation plan for the GTS. Next slide, please. So the vision for the GTS is to reduce the GHG emissions by 5% by 2050, and of course this is in a way to assist us with reducing the harmful emissions and negative environmental impacts associated with the transport system. And of course, we envisage the GTS as the cornerstone of all policy development within the department, especially dealing with all the modes of transportation, especially because we are now promoting green sustainable mobility and the uptake of cleaner and more efficient technologies. And we do base the GTS on the sustainable development principles. Next slide, please. So we found some short-term strategic targets that we have found in the GTS, and the first one is to achieve modal shifts from road to rail, and to minimize single car usage, so that we can reduce the emissions again, and to convert 5% of public and national sector fleet in the first 7 years, and then finally to reduce fossil fuel related emissions in the transport sector by promoting norms and standards for fuel economy and putting in place the proper regulations that promote improved efficiency in fossil fuel powered vehicles. Next slide, please. So at the center of the GTS, the strategic pillars are what we have found to be the very essence of what we highlight when we speak about the GTS. So the green transport technologies are what we have been focusing on the most, because they say that we need to reduce the carbon footprint and over-reliance of petroleum-based fuels by decarbonizing the transport sector. And we are going to achieve this by promoting and facilitating the uptake of electric hybrid vehicles and fuel cell powered vehicles. So the direction that we took when we started having plans to decarbonize the sector was that we needed to promote and facilitate the uptake of electric and hybrid vehicles, as well as ensuring that we decarbonize the sector by minimizing our reliance on petroleum fuel. So with the implementation of the GTS, we have realized that we will need to work with national government, especially because we are so intertwined with our policy development issues. And we do realize that there is an issue that has come up quite a bit that is relating to electric vehicles incentives and how that can possibly be addressed so that we can start facilitating the uptake of electric vehicles, as well as the charging infrastructure that we'll need to consider. Okay, I think you are a slide ahead of me. As well as the electric vehicles that will need, the charging infrastructure that will need to be considered to facilitate the uptake of electric vehicles. And now we get to the electric vehicle discussion. So as I said, the green transport technologies in the GTS call for the reducing of the over-reliance of petroleum fuels by creating an enabling environment for the uptake of electric, fuel cell and hybrid vehicles. So as I mentioned earlier, we also looked at the automotive production development plan, as well as the South African Automotive Master Plan, because in essence, these are the essential documents which deal with the automotive sector in the Department of Trade and Industry. However, we as a policy department, we did have to look at them and how they will potentially affect how the transport sector will be able to achieve the production as well as the uptake of new energy efficient vehicles. Next slide, please. So this is just to say that, next slide, please. We do realize that there will be some challenges within the implementation of the green transport strategy, such as infrastructure, policy alignment, investment and incentives, which will result in implementation challenges. And we have been vigorously trying to address these challenges in order to ensure that as a whole, the policy statements that are coming for new energy efficient vehicles from the transport sector are aligned with all our other sister departments, as well as all the other policy directives within the country. So the strategic partners, I'm on slide number 13. Thank you. So the strategic partners we have for ensuring the uptake of EVs in South Africa are the policy-making departments, as I've been mentioning, research institutions, the ULO e-mobility program, as well as the OEMs that we currently have in South Africa. So next slide, please. This is the Green Transport Implementation Plan that is available on this link if anybody is interested in the Green Transport strategy. Next slide, please. So as a way that we have been trying to ensure that we get to a state where we will be able to have a mass uptake of electric vehicles, we have begun the development of electric vehicles regulation framework, where we're trying to see how an increased uptake of EVs in South Africa will actually impact the sector, and also support the uptake and regulation of EVs in South Africa through developing an EV regulation framework. Through this, we have been able to develop a gap analysis of existing legislation to ensure that whenever we do come up with regulations in the future, we will not hamper the market for EVs, and we will also be able to create an enabling environment to ensure that the market does grow so that we can achieve the decarbonization of the road sector, as we have been saying throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. So the pillars of the EV regulation framework are the standards and safety, incentives and affordability, the charging, the performance, and the environmental impact. These 5 pillars are cross-cutting and will also have to be looked at with other issues such as skills development, training, as well as the local content. That is a very high issue on all the discussions regarding electric vehicles and their uptake thereof in the South African market. Next slide, please. So when we were doing the analysis for the gap analysis for the EV regulations market, we looked at all these 5 pillars across what we have today and what we will potentially need tomorrow. So what we realized is currently we do have the standards and safety for electric vehicles, and we will need to have a bit more of regulations, especially when we enable for the production of EVs to be developed here in South Africa. The incentives and affordability, we don't have any current incentives for EVs in the country, although that is an option that has currently been looked at by the Department of Trade and Industry, again through the new energy efficient study white paper, that green paper that they've come up with. And next slide, please. Looking at the performance, there's currently no standards for performance. We will need to have those performance standards before we can ensure that there's a mass uptake. And then the environmental impact, there's currently no fuel economy standards, so we will need to have some form of standards to ensure that we do get to reduce CO2 emission and incentivize the purchasing of EVs. So the next slide is just a snapshot of what we currently found to be available in South Africa to ensure the mass uptake. We do have regulations. We do not have regulations currently for incentives. We have standards for the electric vehicles and for the chargers, but we don't have incentives for chargers as well. Next slide, please. So in the analysis that we did, we also had to look at the efficiency of the technologies by comparison, and by far we saw that the fuel production efficiency still remained high for the electric vehicles when compared to hydrogen or power to liquid, which is normal internal combustion engines. So the electric vehicle option is still a technology that we are looking at as a major instrument or tool that will enable us to reduce the carbon footprint from the road sector, thereby reducing emissions from the transport sector in totality. Next slide, please. This is the implementation plan for the Department of Transport for the Green Transport Strategy. It is available in the strategy. So these are just a snapshot of some of the projects that we'll be looking at to ensure that we do get to a state where we do lower emissions in the transport sector. We are currently busy with also the green procurement guidelines, specifically for the government fleet, to ensure that we have a starting point where we can start measuring baseline reduction of emissions for the transport sector. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we say that we see the GTS as an implementation tool to minimize the negative effects of energy use by promoting sustainable energy development through efficient practices while investing heavily in green mobility to reduce the carbon footprint of the transport sector. And the green procurement guidelines and the EV regulations framework are also the measures that we'll put in place to ensure that the decarbonization of the transport sector, as stipulated in the GTS, actually does happen. And the last slide will be the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Opang, thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. Obviously, we heard both from Michael and from you that it is essential for the South African automotive industry to make the transformation from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. And we see there a big potential for Austrian companies in supporting and contributing to this change within the South African automotive industry. As discussed before, we come now to the end of the presentations from our panelists. If there are any questions from our attendees, please feel free to write them in the chat. In the meantime, our office already prepared the question for each of the panelists, and I would like to start with James. James, where do you see the potential for Austrian companies entering the South African automotive industry to profit from data-driven solutions such as provided by Tech Alliance?
So with our specific solutions that we offer, one of our solutions we offer is basically the South African vehicle car park. And this will give you insights into how many vehicles are sold, what exact vehicles are in the market. And that kind of information would really help any particular manufacturer or trader determine what to target their production, their product development, and focus particularly on specific vehicles, makes and models in terms of what to develop. So for example, if you're a filter manufacturer, you would obviously cover more of the vehicle car park than someone that specifically just focuses on engine components or mechanical components such as suspension, because you would focus more on your serviceable parts like spark plugs, filters, etc. Our other solutions that we provide on a much higher level, we do what we call it's a product called a CCU. Now this CCU is basically called a close control unit, or it's called a PRIM software, which is product information management. High-level manufacturers and data suppliers that are within the Tech Alliance catalog use this from a production point of view. It helps them with the bill of materials and all the parts. So basically, where we actually focus our solutions. A lot of our data suppliers or brands that we are affiliated with are actual OEMs as well, such as Bosch, such as Lemfoda, TRW. However, we focus particularly only on the automotive aftermarket. So I do believe that the Austrian businesses or organizations that are interested in this potential business development in our country can benefit from this type of analytics and the solutions we could offer to the automotive aftermarket.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this comprehensive answer, James. Michael,
Thank you.
As a representative of the industry, we just heard from Bopang about the green strategy of the South African government. My question would be, are current government action plans, such as the South African Master Plan or the National Development Plan, enough to steer the South African automotive industry towards a successful future?
Yeah, look, I think they obviously are an important legislative framework that are required to be able to catalyze the progression of how the industry should be moving. The challenge is obviously not to have necessarily a framework. The challenge is to implement the framework. Because if you've got a framework that is not implementable, you obviously find yourself in a situation where you have something as good as not having it, because no one is doing anything about it. So I think one of the biggest challenge we have as a country is that we've got some amazing, fantastic pieces of legislation, a lot of policy, documents, but we're very thin in bringing those policies and regulations to life to a point where we can actually realize, their full value. Because if you look at what's happening in other markets, we studied very, very carefully, markets like Malaysia, Thailand, where a regulation or a piece of framework is introduced within the next 3 months after the introduction of that framework, you already begin to see groundbreaking work that follows through. And I think, as South African, we need to be able to make sure that we're able to really, get good at making sure that the policies, the fantastic policies that we have, are actually implemented to help us to drive the growth and the development of the industry quite very strongly.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael. And Bopang, I hope you can switch on your microphone again. For you, I have a question. What are the 3 most important innovative developments, measures of politics and industry players, respectively, that you would name as inevitable to secure the future profitability and success of the South African automotive industry?
I'm sorry, could you please repeat the question? You cut off for a bit there. I'm experiencing load shedding.
Okay. So what are the 3 most important innovative developments, measures of politics and industry players, respectively, that you would name as inevitable to secure the future profitability and success of the South African automotive industries? So what do you see as the most important focus now to get the South African industry from internal combustion engines into the direction for electrical vehicles?
I think the first one, unfortunately, it came out when this question was posed, is the one that I'm suffering from right now, which is Eskom. So if we can get that right and start trying to solve some of our power generation issues, it could be a potential way that we could start having the right results that we want to see. And of course, we always try to focus on people like NAMSA, which are key stakeholders, as I already mentioned. And I would want to say also component manufacturers and even trade partners. So we do not discriminate, actually, but I think the key stakeholders that I would mention now are those ones that I just highlighted.
Thank you so much. And yes, load shedding is something we all experiencing. And we have the generators humming in the background, but I hope still all the audio is very clear to understand for our Austrian audience. If there are any further questions in the chat, I would like to thank our panelists, Bopang Kutswane from the Department of Transportation, Michael Mabasa, the CEO of NAMSA, and James Brown from Tech Alliance, so much for participating today in our webinar. And to the Austrian companies, I hope you now saw the potential of the South African automotive industry. You heard what is possible here in the southern tip of Africa, and we invite you to get in touch with our Trade Commission in Johannesburg. You see our contact details on the slide. If there are any questions, if there is anything you want to know, please feel free to contact us, and we will be happy to support you on your endeavors on the African market. Thank you so much for taking time this afternoon to attend this webinar, and we wish you all the best and have a nice Wednesday afternoon. Thank you.